Hello, friends all over the world. Welcome to the Simply Label podcast. And yes, you've guessed it. My name is Simply Label, and we're coming to you all the way from the beautiful mother city, Cape Town, South Africa. In today's episode, I'd like us to kick off a topic which I believe it will take us probably a couple of episodes to really exhaust and to unpack, and hopefully in the near future we'll start inviting subject matter experts and people with credibility in insofar as the topic of leadership and the journey of leadership is concerned. I want to kick off by making the following statements. Everything rises and falls on leadership. Whether we're talking about a country, and in this context we're talking about the government of a country or the leadership of the country, whether we're talking about a family, and in the family context, of course, we're talking, mother and father who are leaders by default, whether be it in a, informal organization, be it a non-profit organization, and perhaps if you are somebody who's somewhat religiously inclined, we might use the church organization as an example. Everything rises and falls on leadership. In the sports and entertainment world, let's talk about a coach who is probably the critical component of a team, whether that be football or that be rugby, whatever team sport that is. That's why often coaches are the first ones to be fired when teams are not performing or achieving the desired results, as it were. Let's talk about corporations, big or small, especially big ones, when the company is not achieving its profitability goals, so the strategy is simply proven over time not to be working. More often than not, it is the CEO that gets the chop, as it were, and the opposite also applies. So when a company is doing extremely well, often the CEO and his executive and by extension the board, if the shareholders are happy with the outcome, it's often those people right at the top who reap the biggest rewards for the success. Similarly, they take the fall for the failure of organizations. So it stands to reason that one has to, if you're a student rather of leadership, or an aspiring leader, or a leader at any level of any organization, formal or informal, at best we acquaint ourselves with the concept of leadership and really understand it objectively, but also really be truly students who are willing to be better and better at it. If organizations and families and countries rise and fall on leadership, it's best that we endeavor to become a bit better leaders in whatever cap we're wearing, as it were. I think perhaps a good place to start might be to glean on what some experts in leadership are defining leadership as. So can we perhaps start this segment by defining what leadership is, or at least getting some perspective of a definition of leadership from a number of writers. And one such is Dr. John C. Maxwell, who's a proven leadership expert for at least, I think, the last 3 decades or more. He's written New York bestseller books, time and time again. So, he's a leadership consultant all over the world. He's tried and tested. The things and the principles that he teaches are tried and tested. So he says the following in his definition of leadership. He says, being a great leader is all about having genuine willingness and a true commitment to lead others to achieve a common vision and goals through positive influence. He then concludes to say, no leader can ever achieve anything great or long-lasting all alone. Close quote. That is John C. Maxwell. I think that's a powerful and very simple way of looking at leadership, yet very profound. Another leader, who's one of my favorite authors of all time, Dr. Miles Monroe, the late Dr. Miles Monroe, at some point described the following. From a leadership perspective, he says, leadership, I open quote, leadership is the capacity, leadership is the capacity to influence others through inspiration, motivated by passion, generated by vision, produced by a conviction, ignited by a purpose. Very, very loaded. I close quote. Very, very loaded, but very profound. And then one of my most recent favorite authors and leadership consultants, Liz Wiseman, in her book, The Multipliers, or at least she's the co-author of that book. If I might say up front that we're going to glean on some of the lessons and findings that she came up with and documented so beautifully in her book, The Multipliers, in the next couple of weeks in this very segment of leadership. She says the following. She refers in her book to two types of leaders that she describes, and she describes them as the one group she calls the multipliers, and the other she calls the diminishers. And then when she defines a multiplier, she says, a multiplier is someone who uses their intelligence to amplify the smarts and capabilities of the people around them. That is absolutely profound, a close quote. Absolutely profound. And of course, one can only imagine that. The opposite then, who's a diminisher, is one that uses their intelligence to diminish, if not dim, the capabilities and the smarts of the people around them, whether that be, willfully or intentionally or unintentionally. So, that being said, I've got my own little definition, that I've jotted down here. I'm hoping it will mean something to somebody, and I'll attempt it in two ways. The first way is the following. Leadership for me is a selfless love for people that drives one to take a series of selfless acts in order to impact lives for better. Alternatively, leadership is a selfless willingness and commitment to make a positive difference in other people's lives through a series of selfless acts or deeds, of course, over time. So, I think you might have your own, the definition of what leadership is, but in this podcast, I've called it Simply Level for a specific reason, because I'd like us to challenge ourselves and take topics that would otherwise be convoluted, would be complex, and just simplify them, for ourselves and for us to really demystify, the subjects under discussion. And of course, today's one being leadership. Speaking of demystifying subjects, I want to deal for the next few, perhaps two minutes or so, with some commonly known leadership myths. Are you ready for this? Let's deal with this. I'll deal with about 10 of them very quickly in bullet point form. Number one, here's a leadership myth. How about this for you? Leaders are born and not made. Leaders are born and not made. I don't know about you. I think that's the greatest myth. I've seen, people who didn't believe could lead become great leaders. I've seen people who are unassumingly, leaders in their own right. I've seen people gravitate towards them because of the inherent, and maybe even over time, they didn't kick off as leaders, but became leaders, not because they were the designated or the obvious choice, but simply because they learned how to lead over time, with experience, with mentorship, with applying oneself, and etc. So of course, I think I once heard, I don't know if it's Dr. Miles Monroe, who once said, "No, well, of course, all leaders are born, because they've got to be conceived and be in their mother's womb, over 9 months, and typically, and then they are born." But certainly, anyone can become a leader. Here's the second myth: leaders know everything. Wow. I read a quote recently, and forgive me because I forgot who the author is, who said, leaders are not those people who know everything, but they have learned over time to assemble people who know certain things or are experts at certain things, and they've learned the skill of bringing these leaders, or at least attracting them or recruiting them, however you want to define them, to be part of the leader's team, so that through their expertise, this leader can achieve one, of course, common goal for whatever organization they're leading. So leaders don't have to know everything. They just need to know how to assemble the right knowledge around the room or around the table, relative to the goal that needs to be achieved. The third one: leaders are infallible. In other words, leaders cannot make mistakes. They are above reproach. I think it's a touchy one, this one, because of course there has to be principles that govern, leadership, and leaders typically are held to a much higher moral compass or standard than ordinary people who don't occupy positions of leadership, as it were. But to think that leaders are infallible is a mistake, because leaders can make mistakes. The difference is, does the leader own up to the mistake? And do they humanize themselves enough to their followers or their people, so that they become relatable, and certainly they can maintain a following, as it were. Let's look at the fourth one, the fourth myth: leaders only give orders. In my 17 or so years of leadership, it's not a lot of years, I've learned that the worst kind of leaders are only those that shout out orders and sit and fold their arms. There are times where you got to get involved. You got to earn the trust of your people, and you don't earn them from a pedestal. You don't earn that trust, rather, from a pedestal. Okay, let's look at the next one. All leaders are charismatic. Wow. I've seen some great, I've worked personally with some great leaders that are not the most boisterous, not the most charismatic, if I may use that word, or, that command to the room when they walk in, as it were. No, in fact, some leaders I've worked for were great and had a great impact, were quite unassuming. And, you would walk in a room and, or they walk in a room, you don't necessarily feel intimidated, but there's something about their demeanor and the way they treat the people around them that makes them feel, worthy of being, sitting around the table. Yeah, so not all leaders are charismatic. It helps, I suppose, if you are, but it doesn't have to be that way all the time. Let's look at the next one. Leaders have imposing personalities. I guess this one is, somewhat related to the previous one, but also it depends on, I've found, on how you've been led. Certainly we tend to lead how we've been led, and if you've been under an overbearing, superimposing leader, a boss, as it were, you probably tend to pick up those tendencies. But great leaders don't have to have imposing personalities. No, not at all. I can think of a number of examples, and the great and the late Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was one such. He was a different kind of leader, a reconciliatory leader, a leader that led from the heart, as it were. He had the power, certainly. He knew that he could say, hey, now it's time for us to pick up arms and take back what is rightfully belonging to the people that were found in the land, and whatever the case may be. But he didn't. He said, hey, let's reconcile. Let's love one another. And that for me is probably a gigantic example, but I probably wanted to drive home the point that says you don't have to have a superimposing personality to be a great leader. All right, the next myth, leadership comes with age. So in other words, the older you become, the better you lead. What a myth. Yeah, I've seen and have worked with leaders, both in the corporate sense and in the church environment, being a church boy myself, who are, well off in age, but still haven't learned some very basic principles of leadership. Age hasn't helped them. What really helps one is not age, is learning. Being a student of leadership and learning the principles and applying them, as it were. Above everything, it's really just, a thirst for, or an unquenchable thirst, for making a difference in people's lives, not being the boss. So age does not equate better leadership. Okay, let's look at the next one. Leaders possess absolute power. Wow. You only have as much power as the people allow you to have. You only need to look at, some fallen leaders around the world, some of whom are late. They can be autocratic and be tyrants for many, many years. But when the people decide it is time, we've had enough, that's it. There goes your power. You only have as much power as people allow you or permit you to have. So for me, the true power of leadership doesn't lie in your absolute authority. No, it lies in the, in your ability to connect and build a trust with people. And that trust, that sense of trust becomes your leverage, or the currency that allows the relationship to move forward and the organization to achieve what it needs to achieve, in the absence of which it's a complete disaster. Okay, let's look at the last two quickly. Leaders never delegate important stuff. Wow. Interestingly though, I laugh about it, but there are leaders who believe that, hey, this is too important to delegate. And it probably connects to the previous point that I made. As a leader, my view and in my experience, certainly, you got to get to a point where you have empowered and built, the people around you so much that you can trust them, even with what you regard as the most important stuff, the most important decisions, the most important projects, the most important tasks. If not, you will end up working yourself into the bone, and you will create an environment where people doubt themselves and only do things with your approval, as it were. I think personally, the role of a leader is to build the people around you so much that you do not have to be physically there to lead them. You do not have to hold their hands all the time for them to be able to achieve anything. In fact, it is to raise leaders in others, as it were. So a leader has to, at first, of course, empower, but you empower so that you are able, in good time, to be able to delegate and trust others. Because, at the heart of delegation, it is being entrusted with responsibility that would otherwise have to be done by the leader themselves. All right, so it is an absolute myth that leaders or great leaders never delegate important stuff. Let's look at the final one as we close this episode, and we will expand a lot more on other aspects, in the next episode. The final myth: leadership can be attained through study. This is somewhat of a controversial one, because there are people, of course, who have gone to school and have learned. I in my studies, I also had a leadership aspect to it. At the time, it was called management. I did management and economics, and I found that when I got into the real world, everything that I learned sort of became obsolete. Apologies, with time. And it's not because I was taught horribly, but just the practical didn't always match up with the theory. So you cannot just purely study to become a good leader. Certainly, I advocate for reading and lead, and of course, people investing time and knowledge. But that has to be balanced out with the practical, with mentorship, with learning, being a practical student of leadership, as it were, not only through books, but also through experiences. And learning from your mistakes as a leader, and the mistakes of others who have gone before you, as it were. So I wanted to deal with these couple of myths. I know it's a list, but it's certainly not an elaborate list. I think there can be many other myths that we can unpack here, but I just chose to zoom in on these few that I've just detailed, and I hope that they've been somewhat helpful, because I believe in learning what leadership is not, we get to learn what leadership truly is. And I'd like to end our podcast for today, our episode here, this being the inaugural episode for our leadership segment of the Simply Labeled podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. And in the next episode, we'll start dealing with actually what is then leadership. If we have dealt with the myths, then we've got to deal with, then what are those things that I ought to look out for, that I ought to know, that I ought to practice, that would make me an effective leader in whatever sphere of society. And that's just it. Principles of leadership are universal. And that's the point I'd like to end this episode on. The principle of leadership are universal. They're not just limited to a corporate environment or a non-corporate environment. They're universal. One just needs to know, how to apply them and be aware of their impact on others. Ultimately, I just want to say this: if you cannot, if you refuse to be led, you cannot lead. A person, who refuses to be led, will struggle to lead. They will struggle to lead. Let me end it here. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Looking forward to some of your commentary, some of your contributions, and as you kick this off, let's see where it goes. And trusting that we will reach as many people as possible, aspiring leaders, actual leaders, or new managers who've just been newly promoted, really wondering, how do I navigate this journey? I'm hoping that this will be the platform where we get to learn together, empower each other. Looking forward to your comments, your feedback, and till the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hope this has been something worth your time. And data, in South Africa, data is very, very expensive. So thank you very much. I hope this was worth it, every penny. And have yourself a lovely, lovely day further. God bless you. Thank you. This is Simply Label signing out from the Simply Label podcast. Cheers.